You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried, sealed, and erased from every official record, but secrets like this don't stay dead forever. It begins with a name that locals still whisper behind closed doors, the Follings. A well-dressed couple with immaculate manners, a Victorian house on the hill, and a terrifying truth hidden in the bones of their family. 12 children, all adopted. Not a single birth certificate. Not one traceable past. No schools, no medical records, no friends. Just silence. Controlled, rehearsed, and absolute. The town of Millbrook believed the Follings were saints. After all, who else would take in so many unwanted children? But saints don't lock their third-floor doors. Saints don't bribe 5 different adoption agencies across 3 states. Saints don't build families on paperless foundations. From the outside, Howard and Margaret were pillars of the community, donors, churchgoers, dressed in smiles and good intentions. But step inside that house, and something ancient coils in your gut. A presence, a pattern. Not just cruelty, but design. They didn't rescue children. They erased them. And when people began to ask questions, those people disappeared, from town, from memory, from history itself. This isn't just a story. It's a psychological weapon, a glimpse into how the system can be manipulated by those who understand how to bend it, and how to break people inside it. Every child was brought into that house for a reason. Every adoption, a thread in a web designed to bind. To silence. To dominate. And the deeper you look, the more you realize, this wasn't about family. It was about possession. The kind that doesn't just happen in horror films, but in quiet suburbs, under government approval, and behind the mask of love. You think you know what an institution looks like? It's not always a building. Sometimes, it's a home. And sometimes, the most terrifying prison is the one that teaches you to smile while it breaks you. Welcome to the legacy of the Follings. The question isn't how they did it. The question is why no one stopped them, and how many others are doing the same, right now. Still listening? Good. Because once you hear the next part, you can never go back. The house on Elm Street wasn't just a home, it was a machine. Every creaking stair, every locked door, every measured whisper in the halls served a purpose. And that purpose was control. You see, Howard Falling wasn't merely a banker. He was a strategist. Obsessed with hierarchy, silence, and obedience. His wife Margaret? A former pediatric nurse with a fascination for behavioral conditioning. Together, they weren't building a family, they were conducting an experiment. Each child was brought in young, pliable, malleable. Removed from everything they knew and reprogrammed from the ground up. Not through love, but through precision. Rules. Ritual. Punishment. Children weren't allowed to call them mom or dad. They were to say, sir and madam. Any deviation meant discipline. Not the kind you'd report to authorities, the kind that doesn't leave bruises. The kind that rewires the soul. Every child slept in a separate room. No contact. No play. No outside influence. Books were hand-picked. Lessons were doctrine. And surveillance? Constant. If you think this sounds like a cult, you're wrong. It was worse. Cults crave devotion. The Follings didn't want love. They wanted ownership. And the children, those 12 carefully selected orphans, weren't random. They were chosen. Chosen because no one would miss them. Because their paperwork was already missing. Because the adoption system, fractured and underfunded in the 80s and 90s, made it easy to bury people, especially children. Howard donated heavily to the very agencies that placed the children. Not out of generosity, but leverage. Influence. He made sure no one ever looked too closely. No one ever asked the one question that would have unraveled everything. where did these children really come from? But that question would eventually come. Not from officials. Not from journalists. From a dying woman who noticed something no one else dared to say aloud. The children had no eyes, not really. Their gaze was empty, rehearsed, afraid. They didn't flinch. They didn't cry. They didn't speak unless given a signal. And that signal always came from Margaret. That's when she knew. These children weren't being raised. They were being conditioned. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You realize how easy it is to hide darkness behind good manners. Behind money. Behind community service. You realize that evil doesn't just lurk in alleyways or basements. Sometimes, it wears pearls and serves you coffee. Ready for the next revelation? You should be. Because the third floor was never empty. The third floor was the house's secret lung, always breathing, always watching, always sealed. Maria, the housekeeper, called it the floor that heard prayers and turned them into screams. She wasn't being poetic. She was being honest. That floor was Margaret's domain, off limits even to Howard. 3 rooms, always locked. Meals were left outside each door, like offerings to silent gods. And from inside? Sounds no parent should ever ignore. Crying that never stopped. Murmurs in strange patterns. A soft thudding, rhythmic, like someone banging their head against wood for hours. But here's the truth, no one was supposed to know those rooms were occupied. Because officially, the Follings only had 9 children at the time. But Susan Fletcher, the neighbor who once worked child trauma cases, saw it. A 10th child, thin, pale, long-haired, staring out the 3rd floor window with eyes like cold knives. She vanished the moment Susan looked up. Not shy. Not scared. Trained. It was then Susan began to realize that this wasn't just about secret adoptions. This was about disappearances. Children that were brought in but never named publicly. Children with no records, no ceremonies, no acknowledgement. What do you call a person the world has no record of? A ghost. And ghosts can't testify. They can't rebel. They can't ask why. That's what the Follings were creating, blank slates. Perfect subjects. And the 3rd floor? It wasn't just isolation. It was erasure. Imagine being 5 years old, placed in a room alone, no toys, no books, no voices except your own. Days without sunlight. Time without meaning. Punishments not for misbehavior, but for remembering who you were. That's the real horror. Not physical abuse. Psychological deletion. Over time, the children forgot their birthdays. Forgot the sound of laughter. Forgot their own names. Margaret didn't need chains. She used praise and fear. Obedience was rewarded with words like, good subject. Rebellion met with silence. And Howard? He financed the system, monitored compliance, and threatened anyone who asked questions. Including doctors, neighbors, even the police. Because this wasn't a family. It was a closed system of psychological control. Built brick by brick under society's nose. And if you're thinking this can't happen in 1990s America, if you think it's too far-fetched, remember this, in every decade, there's a house like that. A family like that. And a town too afraid to look deeper. The question isn't whether this happened. It's how many others like them are out there, still running their experiments. Still collecting their children. Still locking doors we pretend don't exist. There's a point in every lie where it stops needing to be hidden, because no one's willing to see it anymore. By the time the Follings adopted their 11th child, Peter, even the town's whispers had faded into polite silence. The Follings were donors, patrons of the arts, providers of miracles to the parentless. And yet, not a single birthday party. Not one photograph of a baby shower. No public school enrollment. No medical records. Not a single birth certificate. The town of Millbrook didn't ignore these facts out of ignorance. They ignored them out of obedience. Because power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It leaks into the water, softens the mind, teaches good people to look away. Even Susan Fletcher, the only one who dared to ask real questions, was ignored when she begged the local police chief to investigate. Why? Because Howard Falling was on the town council. He paid for the police station's roof repairs. He shook hands with judges. That's how institutional manipulation works. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. It turns truth into suggestion and fear into loyalty. And by the time Detective Cooper finally got a former housekeeper to speak, it was already too late. You see, the Follings didn't just adopt children. They programmed them. A daily routine of surveillance, reward and punishment. Eye contact discouraged. Individual friendships forbidden. Emotional expression suppressed. They weren't raising children. They were rebuilding identities, from scratch. Teaching obedience, silence, and the art of being invisible. And for what? Why go to such lengths to erase these kids from the world and then reshape them behind locked doors? Some theories say Margaret wanted a perfect family. Others say Howard was part of something darker, a network of wealthy couples who used adoption to create loyal dependents, assets with no paper trail. But here's a truth no one likes to admit: sometimes, people don't do evil for gain. They do it for control. For the godlike power of reshaping another soul. The Follings didn't hide their crimes under floorboards. They hid them in plain sight, behind a facade of kindness, charity, and elite status. And that's why no one stopped them. Because when evil looks respectable, when it wears a pressed suit and writes fat checks to children's hospitals, people thank it. They protect it. That's the lesson here. You are not safe because society tells you you are. You are safe until someone powerful decides otherwise. And in Millbrook, no one had more power than Howard and Margaret Falling. But you're not supposed to know how this really works. Because if you did, if you saw the machinery behind the mask, you'd start asking questions they can't afford to answer. Here's what the Follings truly mastered: institutional camouflage. Every file they submitted, every donation they made, every committee they joined, it wasn't charity. It was currency. With each adopted child, they gained leverage. With each sealed record, they deepened the silence. The agencies they used? Shut down. Burned files. Merged paperwork. No trail. No verification. Just names and photos and a warm, rehearsed smile. And it worked, because the system wants to be blind. Think about it. How could 11 adoptions happen with no pushback? No questions? Because the very institutions meant to protect the innocent were feeding off the Follings' generosity. The children were invisible, yes, but the Follings were everywhere. At charity galas. In courtrooms. On adoption boards. That's how they built the perfect illusion. An illusion so strong, that even after a child, Thomas, was hospitalized with a severe infection from an untreated fracture, the state did nothing. The caseworker wrote it off as an unfortunate error. But you and I both know, errors don't repeat themselves 11 times. This was design. A system of fear, rewards, and vanished oversight. Because Margaret didn't just homeschool the children, she rewrote their world. No outside friends. No television. No visitors without supervision. She controlled their vocabulary, their expressions, even their posture. The goal wasn't education. It was indoctrination. To shape minds soft enough to erase and mold. And Howard? He wasn't just complicit, he was calculating. Every trust fund he created for the children came with clauses. they could only access the money if they never searched for their real families. If they stayed loyal, obedient, silent. That's not inheritance. That's a leash disguised as love. And the most chilling part? No one, not the school district, not the medical board, not the church, spoke up. Because the Follings didn't need to hide behind darkness. They hid in brightness. In Sunday services, fundraiser banquets, and glowing local news profiles. But if you listened closely, you could hear the children scream behind their silence. Now ask yourself, how many other families like this exist right now, beneath your nose, behind curtains you were taught not to peek behind? If you're ready to see what they don't want you to see, comment this phrase twice right now to lock in your transformation. I refuse the illusion. Write it twice below. Not just for the algorithm, but to remind yourself that you will never be blind again. By now, you've seen enough to realize, this wasn't just a twisted household. It was a system hidden inside a system. A parasite that fed on broken infrastructure and societal indifference. But even parasites need silence to thrive. That's where the most disturbing pattern begins to emerge: disappearances. No funerals. No school records. No medical files. Just whispers. The neighbors started noticing it in patterns they couldn't explain. 1 month, there were 11 children. Then suddenly, 10. Must be away with relatives, Margaret would say, smiling from the porch. Then, months later, a different child would appear, older, quieter, just as pale, with no name anyone recognized. Susan Fletcher saw it too. In her notebook, she documented the change in faces, the sudden shifts in names, the way birthdays never aligned with seasons. She even began tracking sightings: who was seen at church, who wasn't, which child sat where each Sunday, like it was a calculated performance. This wasn't coincidence. It was replacement. What happened to the missing ones? No graves. No missing persons reports. Just silence. The third floor, the one no outsider was allowed to enter, was the epicenter of this horror. Vasquez, the former housekeeper, described food trays left outside locked doors. Children crying, then not crying. Toys that were moved but never seen in use. These weren't rooms, they were holding cells. And yet, when Detective Cooper brought this evidence to his superior, he was shut down. Told to back off. Reminded who the Follings knew. That's when it all clicks. The Follings were more than just disturbed parents. They were protected assets, symbols of moral superiority in a town built on polite silence. Institutions bent to their will because questioning them would unravel too much. Imagine being a detective staring at the truth but being ordered to pretend it doesn't exist. Imagine being a child, locked behind a door, watching adults come and go, while you disappear from existence one day at a time. And the final insult? The trust funds. Set to activate at age 25, but conditioned to buy silence. If any child ever searched for their real identity, they'd lose everything. Do you understand now? It wasn't just control. It was a contract of forgetting. A deal made by terrified children who had nowhere else to go. The question isn't, how did this happen? How many more doors are locked in towns just like yours? There's a reason you've never heard about the Follings on the evening news. Not a single headline. No breaking exposé. No national outrage. Because the system wasn't built to expose predators like them, it was built to protect them. Every institution meant to safeguard the innocent had failed in perfect succession. Child Protective Services. Local police. Medical professionals. Even the church, where the children sat in eerie rows, staring blankly ahead like mannequins rehearsed into submission. And when one brave man, Detective Cooper, finally tried to break through the silence, he wasn't met with backup, he was met with warnings. The police chief didn't just dismiss him. He threatened reassignment. Budget cuts. Career ruin. You don't touch the Follings, he said. You'll burn your future to the ground. Let that sink in. This wasn't ignorance. This was deliberate suppression. Because the Follings weren't just another twisted family, they were a mirror held up to the system's darkest impulse, to preserve power over truth. But Cooper didn't let it go. Instead, he went underground. Off the books. Quiet visits. Private interviews. And what he found confirmed every dark suspicion Susan Fletcher had laid out on her deathbed. The adoption agencies the Follings worked with? Many had been investigated years earlier for falsifying documents, fast-tracking illegal placements, and laundering children through bureaucratic loopholes. You heard that right, laundering children. Like property. Like inventory. And yet, no one had connected the dots, until now. When Cooper traced the origin of the twins, Peter and Paul, it led to a shut-down orphanage in Ohio, one that had been accused of misplacing records, selling identities, and losing infants in transit. But the files were gone. Burned in a suspicious fire 2 years before Cooper's investigation. Convenient, isn't it? Records vanish. Witnesses disappear. Children fade into history without ever truly existing. And the Follings? Still smiling. Still donating to churches and schools. Still hosting fundraisers for at-risk youth. They weren't just hiding in plain sight. They were being celebrated. And here's the twist that should keep you up tonight. For every Falling family you learn about, there are 10 more that you never will. Because evil doesn't wear horns in our world. It wears respectability. And it shakes your hand at community fundraisers. Now, if you've made it this far, comment below, "I see the locked door." Comment it twice. Say it like a code. Because if you're still watching, you've already stepped over the threshold. The phrase, "I see the locked door," isn't just symbolic, it's a confession. Because once you recognize it, once you realize that so much of what you believed about safety, family, and truth was a curated illusion, you can't go back. That third floor of the Falling house wasn't just a physical space, it was the manifestation of what society refuses to confront. Children kept in isolation. Rooms sealed not by locks, but by silence. And all the while, Margaret and Howard appeared at charity galas and board meetings, sipping wine and shaking hands, as if there weren't forgotten souls whispering behind their walls. But the truth has a sound. It leaks. And sometimes, it screams. Cooper began building a new case, brick by careful brick. And then he made a discovery that turned even his stomach. A notarized document hidden in property records revealed the Follings had purchased an adjacent plot of land, undeveloped, wooded, and never disclosed. It was registered under a shell corporation. Why would a family with 11 children, confined to a tightly controlled Victorian home, need a secret forested plot under a different name? Cooper went to the land himself. What he found was a clearing. And in that clearing, a well. Covered, old, rusted shut. And nearby, faded ribbons tied to tree trunks, fragments of children's clothing, aged by time and weather. The soil had been turned, again and again. No official graves. No records. But the kind of stillness that hangs in places where the dead never got to speak. Cooper took samples. Soil tests confirmed high traces of calcium phosphate, decomposed bone. Not proof of murder. Not proof of which child, or how many. But enough to ignite the dread that every missing document, every fake name, every sealed file wasn't just oversight. It was evidence of erasure. And yet, even with this knowledge, Cooper's attempts to escalate the case were met with more walls. The district attorney refused to issue a warrant. His supervisor filed a formal reprimand for unauthorized investigation. The town that once smiled in unison now narrowed its eyes at him. Whispers began to spread. He's obsessed. He's unstable. He's making things up. But he wasn't. He had seen the locked door, and now so have you. You were never meant to see past the facade. That's why stories like this are buried under decades of polite silence and bureaucratic dust. Because if one case like the Follings is real, just one, then none of the systems we trust are safe. Cooper knew this. And so did the people who began to shadow him. First, it was subtle: his car tires slashed, documents missing from his office, a warning call with no voice on the other end. Then came the offer. A man in a black sedan, parked outside his home, handed him a sealed envelope. Inside? A letter typed on plain paper: "Drop this. You'll be taken care of." And beneath it, a cashier's check for $250,000. Cooper didn't cash it. Instead, he scanned it, saved the file, and stored it on a secure server off-site. Because by now, he understood, this wasn't just about the Follings. This was about a network. He started digging into the adoption agencies the Follings used. Half were defunct. 3 were connected to a non-profit accused of trafficking undocumented children during the 1980s. The files weren't destroyed, they were bought. Archived in private collections. One of the agency's founders had ties to a religious institution known for special placement adoptions. Children deemed hard to place. Children no one would miss. That's when Cooper called in a favor. A friend at the FBI, someone buried deep in cyberforensics, agreed to help, off the record. Within days, they uncovered encrypted communication between Howard Falling and an anonymous email address traced to a now dismantled server in Luxembourg. The messages were coded, but the subject lines were chilling: inventory confirmed. Transit secure. Loss count, 2, and dates, every time a new child arrived. You still think this is just a story? Then comment below: right now, I see the locked door. I will never close it again. Type it twice. Lock that awareness in your mind. Because we are no longer talking about a family secret. This is a systemic mechanism of acquisition, control, and disposal. And here's the truth that breaks most men: everyone looked the other way. Teachers, neighbors, church leaders, the mayor. They let it happen. Some out of fear. Some out of benefit. But most simply couldn't handle the cost of knowing. That's why stories like this disappear. Not because they lack evidence, but because they demand action. And action means sacrifice. Cooper didn't sleep for 3 days after reading those emails. Not because of fear, but because his mind was unraveling, thread by thread, as the scale of the deception came into focus. This wasn't just about abuse. It was industrial-level disappearance. Children as currency. Paper trails as illusions. Every transaction engineered to look like mercy, every lie wrapped in the language of charity. One night, he received a USB drive, anonymous drop, no return address. On it, a video. Grainy footage. Time-stamped. 2:47 a.m. A narrow hallway, dimly lit, likely inside the Falling house. The camera, hidden, shaky, shows a child being led by the arm down the hall by Margaret herself. The child's hands are bound. Muffled sobs echo as she opens the third-floor door. What followed would be burned into Cooper's mind forever. The child hesitates. Margaret whispers something. The child walks forward. The door shuts. Lock clicks. Darkness. The file was named, offering_12.mp4. 12 children. 12 adoptions. No certificates. What if it wasn't just lack of paperwork? What if it was by design? What if the Follings didn't adopt 12 children, they processed them? Cooper's own voice, recorded in his case notes, trembled as he asked, "Where is James? Where is Elizabeth? Are they still alive?" Because here's what the town of Millbrook never knew. By 1996, only 5 of the original 12 children could be verified as seen by outsiders in over a year. The others? Traveling. Homeschooled. Ill, the excuses were always ready, always rehearsed. But no one had seen Catherine since 1994. William hadn't been to church in 2 years. Anne? No school records. No photos. No trace. And yet, no one filed missing persons reports. Not a single one. That's the genius of institutionalized disappearance. You make the system part of the story. You turn the paper trail into a maze. You bury your sins in plain sight and dare the world to dig them up. By the time Cooper submitted his formal request to unseal the adoption files, the Follings were gone. House empty. No forwarding address. Bank accounts closed. The Victorian mansion on Elm Street was left with food on the stove and clothes still drying on the line. It was as if they had evaporated. But they hadn't. People like that don't disappear. They just change names. Change towns. Start again. And maybe, just maybe, they're already doing it somewhere else. It took nearly a decade before the house on Elm Street was finally sold. The new owners, a young couple from out of state, planned to renovate the place into a bed and breakfast. But within weeks, their contractor refused to work the job. He claimed the structure had bad bones. Not structurally, spiritually. Beneath the drywall, they found hidden alcoves. Behind bookshelves, sealed doors. A staircase that led nowhere. One crawlspace was filled with children's shoes, tiny, mismatched, aged by dust and time. The couple moved out before the renovations even began. The house sat vacant again. But Cooper, long retired, never let it go. He kept the files. The notes. The whispers. Because here's the darkest truth. The Follings were never prosecuted. No charges. No arrests. No public scandal. Why? Because the moment someone tried to push deeper, the system, that same system that was supposed to protect the children, pushed back harder. The agencies, the courts, even the police department, they closed ranks. Sealed files. Stonewalled. Do you understand what that means? It wasn't just a family's secret. It was an institutional collaboration. A quiet pact between power and silence. And Cooper, like anyone who tries to dig too deep, was branded a conspiracy theorist. His career ended. His credibility, shredded. And that's exactly how they win. Not by denying the truth. But by making the truth too costly to believe. Ask yourself this: why were there no birth certificates? Why were the children kept isolated? Why were donations exchanged for adoptions? Why were third-floor rooms locked from the outside? This is more than abuse. More than control. This is systemic erasure. 12 lives, names, identities, birthrights, vanished. Turned into shadows. And the silence? It was purchased, protected, and polished into reputation. But for those of us who stare into the void long enough, who listen to the echoes from locked rooms, one truth emerges like a scream in the dark: some families adopt children to save them. Others, to erase them. The Follings legacy isn't just a tragedy. It's a blueprint. A method. A mechanism. And the reason it matters, still matters, is because it didn't end in Millbrook. It's still happening. Different names. Different cities. But the playbook stays the same. And unless men like you start asking the forbidden questions, who profits from the silence? Who engineered the system? Who's really pulling the strings? Then history will keep repeating, and you'll never even know it's happening. What if I told you this wasn't an isolated case, but a template? That the Follings were not an anomaly, but a rehearsal? The shadows they operated in still exist, only now, they're darker, colder, more sophisticated. Today, you see a polished adoption video go viral. A forever family celebrated on social media. But you don't see what happens behind closed doors. You don't see the falsified paperwork, the expedited approvals, the children placed out of state with no real oversight. You don't see the way the system bends, not by accident, but by design, for those who know how to pay, play, and disappear. The story of the Follings is terrifying not just because it happened, but because it was allowed. 12 children with no documented origin. No birth certificates. No future they chose. Just, gone. Taken in. Controlled. Vanished. And even when whispers turned to testimony, even when photos were shared and files passed hand to hand, the machinery of silence turned louder. Judges looked away. Agencies reclassified. Records were sealed. And the house? It still stands. Empty. Waiting. Like a scar on a town that doesn't want to remember. But you remember now. Don't you? And memory, that's where your power begins. Most men go their whole lives asleep. Distracted. Entertained. Obedient. But you're not like most men. You've seen the blueprint. And once seen, it can't be unseen. So here's your moment. Mark it. Claim it. Comment below, I see through the silence. I see through the silence. Lock that phrase into your identity. Let the algorithm know you've awakened. Let the world know you're watching. Because what they fear most is not exposure. It's recognition. When enough men recognize the pattern, when enough of you awaken, question, connect, their control begins to crack. You are not powerless. You are dangerous, if you choose to be. This story is over. But your descent? It's only just begun. Follow the threads. Question the spotless reputations. Watch for the houses that never show children outside. And when you see the signs, really see them, don't stay quiet. That silence is how monsters grow. And you? You're not one of the obedient. You're one of the watchers now. Welcome to the hidden war. Welcome to the resistance. And remember, the next time a smiling couple shows off their perfect family, ask yourself who's missing from the photo.